Well, welcome friends, colleagues, strangers that shouldn't be strangers. We certainly welcome you to today's edition of the Data Driven Ag webinar series. And it's time, and even though we might get a couple still joining, I'll go ahead and kick us off here. I'm Dennis Buckmaster, a Dean's Fellow for Digital Ag and a Professor of ADE here at Purdue. It's my privilege to sort of coordinate and get people to participate in these to sort of tell the world what is happening in Purdue agriculture. So it's a weekly series, you know that, you signed up for it. Quite a great variety of topics here to cover in the spring. Next slide. So just a little bit of a word from our sponsors. Of course, you can tell because of the communication you got and the color scheme here, but this is a Purdue Agriculture sponsored series. Not all of the participation will be Purdue employees, but many of them are, of course. So we would point you to our Digital Ag Resources website and the Purdue Extension UAV website. Just a tremendous package of resources, events, postings, content about lots of things there, so we point you there. And then part of this series is supported by the WIN, the Wabash Heartland Innovation Network. So we encourage you also to go to win.org to find out about that organization. Next. So just two slides here. We can look at this list a minute. This is the slide. These are the topics coming up in upcoming weeks. So we certainly invite you to participate. Do realize that all of these are archived so on YouTube. So if you happen to miss one, or you have friends and colleagues family who ought to see these, well then just pay attention and send them to the recorded version if they happen to miss the live version. I certainly welcome that. All right, so today's presentation is actually recorded. It's a previous presentation that Dr. Casteel has given. So we ask that through the presentation, you keep your microphone, cameras off. Do freely use, we highly encourage you to pose questions in the chat, even during the presentation. We might be able to have one of these experts answer your questions, like during the presentation while that question is on your mind. So do feel free to do that. At the end, we'll let you unmute and post some questions live as a little Q&A with Shaun and Richard as well. So just by way of introducing today's presentation, we've got Dr. Shaun Casteel, who is a faculty in the Department of Agronomy here at Purdue, and his graduate student, Richard Smith, who did this work. So maybe Shaun, first to you before we kick this off, how did it come to be of a great interest to you to use UAVs to make soybean decisions?
Well, it really started back in 2017. Bob Nielsen and I went to a field day over at the Davis farm, and we had a couple of Quantum pros out there, Quantum 4 pros, and we went out and started playing with them that day. And on the drive home, Bob and I both ordered a Phantom 4 Pro. Within 3 days, we had it, and we were already hooked. And so just saw a lot of opportunities. And with this presentation, this work with Richard, one of many opportunities is just assess a stand early and to make a call of a replant situation or assess field capacity in terms of plant health. So, a lot of opportunities from a bird's eye view. We see it from a sprayer, boy, when we go up to 250 foot, 400 foot, we see a lot more and a lot of management opportunities.
Great. And so Richard, you've been working under Dr. Casteel as a PhD candidate here at Purdue. Maybe just go back a few years. What inspired you to want to dive in the detail of UAVs and soybean production?
Well, I grew up in Arkansas around agriculture. And in college, I went to Arkansas State University. I studied agriculture. And while I was there, I worked for a research group that had some PhD students that were working with UAVs, and they kind of taught me their ways and led me to here.
Good. Well, without further ado, we're all kind of standing by here. But Randy, if you could just roll the presentation. And please freely use chat with your questions.
Hello, my name is Shaun Casteel, an extension soybean agronomist at Purdue University. Today I'm going to be talking about some of our work with sUAS, or the UAVs, drones, whatever you want to call it. This is work that's been going on the last couple of years with myself and my PhD student, Richard Smith. So we're going to be sharing some of our results of those applications. Drones have been around the last few years and been a pretty big hype since 2016, 2017 in particular. And so, like Bob and myself have gotten into this. And so to use it on the applications of searching a field and seeing what's going on, bird's eye view, literally, and to catch some of the tire damage in a field like this, you zoom in and realize that there's some issues with the planting passes. There's other applications, just this casual scouting that we've talked about for the last few years to see where the pockets are in the field, some issues that are occurring. So here, soybean and corn, poor stands there, obviously later before any management that can occur, but kind of zooming in to see what's going on the stand side of things. And really what we're going to talk about today is the plant population, the early season assessments. We have issues of standing water year in and year out. And so here's an example of a stitch flight. And seeing those poor pockets, those swales have had the standing water, and then whether to go back in to do any replant. Picture on the right is going to be the vary, and so it's just basically another way of doing an NDVI, a vegetative indice, with just a regular camera, red, green, blue, instead of a multi-spec. But the idea comes across that the red being the poor areas and need to be looked at a little more intensely. So when we start talking about the idea of replant situations, stand counts, time of planting, that all comes into play. You guys have heard me talk about timely planting of soybeans is very critical for high yielding soybeans, and this goes right part and parcel with the idea of replant. If we're going to have to go out there and replant, we're a later plant, and so the yield potential is lower. Even if our plant stands are, quote, lower than what we wanted, let's say that they're 80, 90,000 plants, that's not necessarily going to be a replant scenario because we still have the benefit of a timely planted. Later planted soybean crop's going to take fewer days, so in other words, it's going to mature faster in the same number of days and have less par, so that's just basically the sunlight. And so that's kind of the reasoning, the background of making this call of replant, of the late planting, what implications there are that come out of that, because we're not going to have the same yield level as that timely planted crop. Obviously, when you go out to do stand counts, you want to know the variability in the field, and before you drop a planter in and out, the time that's invested in that, and just those decision factors. So really what it comes down to is, how do you take soybean plants? You know, everyone loves those hula hoops, even my kids. I've got 3 kids and they've got the hula hoops going at home. So I'll take them out and then we'll go through and do the stand counts and just count plants. You know, they got to know their numbers too. So they have fun doing it, but I'm not sure everyone's got a 6, 4, and 2-year-old to go out to do stand counts. And so, you know, this can be time consuming. This takes a little bit to get across the field. So in this case, you know, we would do a hula hoop and we'd count in that hula hoop, there's 10 plants. And so we'd factor that up. That's 78,000 plants. Well, that's that one 32-inch diameter hula hoop. And does that really represent the whole field? Here in the last 5, 8 years, I went to a linear method just to make it a little bit easier. Take a tape measure out and count 1/10,000th of an acre. And this really came out of doing yield estimates, and we brought it earlier in the season to do a good stand count. And so the idea is that, okay, we count how many plants are in that 1/10,000th of an acre, but I double that to get a decent representation. So in this case, if we counted 24 plants in 2 1/10,000ths of an acre, so 21 inches plus another 21 inches of 2 15-inch rows, 24 plants divided by 2, that gets you at 120,000 plants. So the mass there and the ability to, okay, we can size this up, but does that really do a good job of assessing the field? Because then you've got to walk to the other parts of the field and then know where you're walking on a 40, 60, 80 acre field. And then we got to bring in this fun thing of growth stage. When do you do it? This is, you know, the growth stage VE, the plants emerge, you got the cotyledons and the growing point above the soil surface. If you recall here in the 2020 season, like May 8th, May 9th, we got a freeze down to 26 degrees. And so then we're having to go back to assess, okay, are plants dead or dying? And then do a stand count and do a replant. So timing is critical on this. That's what's really going to come into play. So VE to V2, those stages. So within second trifoliate, so you've got 1, 2 trifoliates opened up. within this time period, we need to be doing the stand counts and assessing whether we're going to replant. Most of us, if we've gone through this effort, it's, oh, I'll wait till V1, V2, do a stand count and hope that we have enough so we don't have to go back and do a replant. But by V2, that's actually getting very late for doing a replant and getting the full benefit of the growing season. In other words, we're shortening ourselves on that yield potential. Even though these aren't terribly large plants, you know, we're talking 2 trifoliates of maybe 3-4 inches tall, the ability to gain ground in terms of the year is limited. So here's an example before I get into some of the drone work of the replant scenarios. This is one that was done years ago before I even got here, and it's a nice classical replant scenario at V2. So whenever the original stand here in blue was 2 trifoliates is when we went in, or my predecessor went in and added more plants, added more seeds. So then you can look here with the 200,000 seeding rate, yield was 58 bushel. 132,000, again, nothing surprising there. You guys have heard me talk about 120,000 plants is more than enough. Now we go into let's go about 3/4 of the way over. We'll go down to 66,000. Just leaving that stand as itself, yield is 50.6 bushel. That's really on the gray area for this replant decision. You've heard me say 60, 70,000 is, oh, do I make the call for a replant or not? The next bar over is they added in 132,000 to that original 66 I was standing. So what came at the end of the year? 41 bushels came from that original 66,000. 132,000 added 10.5 bushel, but at the end of the day, it really didn't yield any different than the bar to the left at just 66,000. So knowing your stand and knowing what the yield potential is comes into play. This replant, you're going to be tearing up some of the original stand. And again, this is V2, so maybe on the order of a little bit late. And then just the jump off the cliff, we're going to till it all up and do a replant and just to get a nice, beautiful stand at 200,000, but yield level at 37.5 bushel. It just doesn't have the season left to finish that out. One more of kind of the past replant, plant-to-plant competition to get the idea of when this really needs to be done. This is a critical point of doing stand assessments and doing a replant decision. In this study, we looked at a low population and delayed it. So we had 50,000 plants originally on 15-inch rows, and then we brought in another 50,000. So we thinned to that exact population with the timing of delay. And so what I mean by that, the upper left is no delay. So we had 50,000 seeds or plants plus another 50,000. So that overall is 100,000 plants. You go to the VC stage. So now we're talking about the cotyledons and unifoliates fully expanded on that original 15-inch, 50,000 plants. Then we seeded in, and so you have a little bit of about a stage delay or so. You go down to the bottom left, V2 is when the original stand was V2, 50,000. Then we interseeded, so this plant-to-plant competition. So these last two, the VC to V2, that's the replant window that we often talk about. And then again, jumping off the cliff once more, V4, this growth stage, when the original plants are at V4, we really shouldn't be replanting or overseeding. It's too far gone, and you'll see why near the end of the season. This one is 100,000 plants. Again, this one's just way beyond what you need. A lot of people want a fuller stand than 100,000 and 100,000, but you can tell the competition's there. Canopy is already there. These plants are V7, about to go into reproductive stages. But that same setup of no delay, VC, V2, and V4. So at the end of the season, what we're talking about to make this decision, this timing, this point that I'm stressing today is, okay, no delay on the left. On the left is the original 50,000 plants. On the right, that picture is the plants that were interseeded. So that overall stand is 100,000 with no delay. Second picture of VC, okay, the original plants on the left were VC when we interseeded. So again, the overall stand is still 100,000, but we have the delay and 50,000 coming up later. By the time we get to V2, and this is perfectly placed, this is no damage to the original 15-inch rows that are planted at 50,000, you can see how much they're struggling, that they're just trying to get through all that canopy, even at just a low stand of 50,000 of original, and so they don't branch, they really extend their internodes and don't pod well. And so the yield potential is quite low and really don't gain anything. And then as you might anticipate by V4, we just get a twig by the end of the season because it's shaded out. One more just on the 100,000. it just basically pushes it one stage earlier, because we have so many plants out there already. It's shading, canopy, and so when we lose the plants that have been interseeded, it's by V2 stage that we've already lost them. All right, so hopefully that's kind of set the stage for when do we really need to be out there doing these stand counts and making the replant decision. It's going to be early, and that's a hard one. That VE, VC. VC is probably really the earliest that we can feel comfortable and confident making the stand count assessment, but know that we may even still have some plants that are still emerging later. But by V2, we should already have made this call, and probably even before that. So across this growing season, I'm going to show a number of examples that we've done over the last couple of years. Vegetative period, so going VE to V3, obviously a year and year they'll change, whether it's going to V5, V6 before we transition into reproductive stages, R1, R2, and so forth. So I'm going to concentrate on the left portion, the early season, but we took flights all season long. So again, it goes back to, okay, how are we taking these stands? So we talked about hula hoop, we talked about linear method, and then trying to assess that whole field. And so it comes into this spatial variability again. Okay, how do you know where to go to truly represent that field if you're walking it? And so the time that's involved with that, the ability to truly assess, if we do a W pattern, you might catch the poor spots, you might not. If you're going out there as early as I'm suggesting the VCV1, you might not know that this is a poor area. You see these drowned out spots on the orthomosaic aerial view, but again, you got to be able to find those. So our objective was to assess stands of soybeans and try to find optimal plant population, growth stage timing, and maybe even another method. Instead of just counting plants, maybe it's a canopy coverage. Maybe it's a vegetative indice. And so that's kind of the goal of what we've been doing over the last couple of years in assessing soybean stands with the UAV or the UAS system. So these were done with our typical just field scale trials. And so the idea of having seed rates, we got to go low to high. So seeding rates 50 to 250,000 seeds per acre, usually about 5 seeding rates. So that 50,000 seed increment. And then whatever we get, we get. In terms of the stand, we'll use 2 different cultivars for these locations, and then 3 to 5 replications per location, depending on the size of the field, if we're talking a 40-acre field or 80-acre field. And again, this shouldn't be anything too taxing. Just understand we're doing the strips across the field and having the replication. So this is a case where 50 to 250,000 randomized across the field, so we catch the variability of the field. They're the 40 to 60 foot wide and 1,000-foot run type plots. So these were done across the state at our packs. We started in 2018. Today I'm going to probably just highlight some of the recent 2020 results and mention a few of the 2019 with the short time I've got. We went across from the Miggs farm south of Lafayette, the Acre farm, agronomy farm, West Lafayette, moving up to Penny near Wanata, the northeast near Columbia City, Davis, East Central, and then the southeast near North Vernon. So we've done those. Today I'm going to just do a subset of those trials. So here in 2019, if you guys recall, 2019 was a late planted year. And so planting dates of the 4 that I've pulled out for today, Penny, Miggs, Northeast, and Southeast went from June 4th to June 12th. We had a 2 pairing of conventionals with Penny and the Miggs farm, and then the Northeast and the Southeast were the no-till corn stalks. Brought in 2 varieties from Creden's lineup. Again, paired these up so we have something that's a similar maturity group, but maybe a different plant structure. Again, making that claim that maybe there's some varietal differences and make sure that we get a good number. And then down in 2020, just 3 of the set. We've got more, just time to process all of this. June 3rd plant and May 14th at the Davis farm. Southeast was kind of wet and to get in at June 3rd. Again, a good mixture of either a conventional till or a no-till, and then the 2 varieties to see how they respond, both in terms of the growth habits, the leaf structure, and things of that nature. Measurements, as you can imagine with the PhD project with Richard's study, there's a litany of things that we take, and just the flat out time to do these flights. So plant populations, early and late, vegetative indices, all of these were done with our Matrice. DJI's Matrice 200. It's with an RGB camera. We can certainly change out, and that's why we bought this, to put in a multi-spec or something else. But we're trying to get to the field scale for the grower, for you, the consultant, to use just a red, green, blue camera. So obviously this drone is the higher end, $10,000, $15,000. But I mean, this technology, the way that we're approaching it, you could have a $1,500, $2,000 drone with a red, green camera that's probably going to do just fine. It's the same mentality of what we're looking at. So any of the vegetative indices that I'll be talking about today are all based on these bands of red, green, blue, not a multi-spec or hyperspectral. We're also looking at canopy cover. And so my thought process on the onset of this study is that we are not counting soybean plants. We're looking for an optimal canopy by growth stage, an optimal canopy coverage by growth stage. Soybeans, just in their nature, you guys should have that appreciation to do an individual plant count and to go across the field in a timely fashion. We just flat out can't do it, versus corn that's spaced every 6 inches or so. I think that opportunity certainly is there. On the soybean front, my mentality is to switch it a little bit. Let's look at vegetative indices, canopy cover. Obviously, we would go into grain yield, some of the terrain attributes. So understand the spatial variability in the field. So whether we're talking about slope, elevation, this TWI, total wetness index, so its ability to kind of predict where the wet spots in the field are going to be, and to use that information to maybe do targeted sampling or to do some of these transects that we're looking at. So with that, the Matrice, we did 2 different versions. We did what I call more the standard across the whole field, stitching the field, flight pattern for the whole field. What I've come to in the years is an altitude of 250 foot, overlap 75, 75. Now we can certainly go up to higher altitude, 400 foot at the ceiling, but some of our farms were near airports, and so that class airspace we were kind of getting into. And the resolution, I feel like this resolution actually does a good job for us and still to assess early. And so that's why we settled on that. And then we'll also have a lower transect to look at here in a second. So here's an example of just, we've got the aerial image, old aerial image of the field. You can see some of this variability based on the soil types and colors and residue. And you can kind of predict where the wet spots are going to be. And so the trial is overlaid, polygon layers. We create this TWI, this total wetness index, and to say, okay, these are the chunks where it's going to be wet, and these are the chunks where they're not going to be wet. And then we create a program to assign the transect. So we're going to go perpendicular to these seeding rate plots with a low transect, so a 30-foot altitude, to get very, very fine resolution, to do the comparison of, okay, 30-foot altitude versus 250 foot. We're not going to fly a whole field at 30 foot. There's just not enough time, not enough batteries to do that. So this is, okay, how good can we get with the standard versus, let's say, 30 foot is ideal. And so in this program, we're picking the transects that are equally representing the spatial variability. In this case, we were looking at the wetness index. And so then in doing this is selected, go out, and we've got clay pigeons that we've targeted. Those show up easily in these images. And then within those, we do the ground truthing. So the plant counts, we go in, and we've got the PVC pipe that we've laid out 10 foot by 10 foot. And so then counting those quadrants, and then we can build that up. So now we've got a ground truth, we've got ground control points, and we know exactly on the image what pixels are representing what plants. And so physically counting those, and then going back to the post-processing of images and all the time that's involved with that. I mentioned ground control points. You've got to have this. If you don't have it, we're going to have shifting even whenever we do the same plan flight across the field. So we've got to have these, so then it anchors the images, because you're stitching 200, 300 images together. So you got to stitch them together and then anchor them. So this allows us to anchor that field time and time again. So then we know we're representing the same area, same pixels. So here's a quick time series of one of our farms and looking at this. So this is the 250-foot altitude, no-till corn stalks. This is up at the Northeast Farm, if I recall, looking at that image. Growth stage is V1. You look at that, you're like, what's there? There's hardly anything. You can't really see anything. So let's advance. Again, we've been ground control, so you can start to see the seeding rates pull out. This stage is V3. Coming into R1, obviously shows up even more. And and then you get to the end of the season, middle of the season, R3, and advancing. So that shows up easily, but if you were to go back, I'll try to go back, here we go. This V1, we want to make this call, this decision, and you're like, what in the world is there? I can't see anything. So that's where the computer and the processing comes into play, and so there's some exciting potential playing out there, because my naked eye can't pull those differences out that early, at least not from there. So now we're overlaying that 250-foot altitude and then zooming down in these two transects that are 30 foot, so a much finer resolution, closer to the ground on this image. So we select that transect going perpendicular to the plot. And then this is very intensely image, capturing those, so then we can, again, position the image that is on that clay pigeon perfectly every single time. On the zoomed in version, you can kind of have appreciation down the left. That is what the picture resolution is for a 250-foot altitude of that same field, same day. The picture split screen to the right is the 30-foot. You can start to see those individual rows, and you know that's a V1. And so that stage is what we want to call, is what we want to be able to say, what's the variability in that field? Do we need to do a replant or not? And then, again, the breadcrumbs going across these individual plots. We are dead center on those transects. We've zoomed in on a couple of these lower population on the bottom, higher population on the top, the clay pigeon, the dead center. So then, again, that's another way of ground control points. So in this, we're building out canopy cover. So we're using this red, green, blue. We're going to calculate vegetative indices like I've talked about. And then some of the part that Richard's definitely doing and I'm not is the ability to do the binary threshold, basically yes, no. This idea of having ones and O's, right? If it's a green pixel, yep, we're going to count it. If there's not a green pixel, it doesn't get counted. And so we go through the image of the top is just your red, green, blue. We go through and do a vegetative indice. This one I think is probably the vary. And then out of that is, okay, the red, now we switched it, the red in the center, red pixels are being counted, and then the green ones are not, and then that goes into the black and white that's at the bottom, that binary threshold. And so by doing that, on that known area, we can calculate the canopy cover. So plant pixels divided by all the pixels and get canopy coverage. Here's a time series looking at that. So at V1 and going down from the picture that was taken, some of the vegetative indices will vary. We switched to GLI this year, green leaf index. So I think that's showing even more promise. And then what the actual canopy is. So at V1, we're at 8% on this example. V3, you can have appreciation and kind of guess what the canopy is. We're going to 21%. V5, 68%. By R1, nearly all of it is covered, 97%. And if you guys recall my talks on timely planting and when do you want soybeans canopy, it's green to the eye by the 4th of July. We want that canopy closed by the time it's R1, and bam, we hit that. And so that's the ideal for a planting season. Now again, go back to V1 and even the VC that's not even on this screen. Can we get a set canopy cover, a percent that's going to be, yes, we have enough to maximize the yield potential. That's the ultimate goal for me, not counting those plants, but give me what's the canopy coverage and is that good enough? So to kind of wrap up, we'll use some of the 2020 data that's pretty impressive. There's a lot going on here because there's so many different vegetative indices that come into play. I'm going to lay this out. I'm going to do 3 locations and wrap up for today, but just know that there's some exciting things coming on. What we've graphed is the correlation, the R square. And so all you need to know is as you get closer to 1, the ability for that vegetative indice or canopy coverage is also in this to predict plant population is higher. So if it's higher, it's better. If it's lower, it's not. And so the probability of predicting plant population with these indices is what we're looking for. And so I'm going to lay out the top one. This is at Penny in 2020. This is our low altitude, so high resolution is what you need to think about. So it's 30 foot, very fine detail. The canopy coverage is the dotted line, so it's at the top, 0.8 R square, very good. You know, think about anything 0.8, 0.9, it's going to be hard to do anything better than that. Canopy coverage from VC, I've got the growth stage growing across in the middle and the dates at the bottom for 2020 by VC. So cotyledons and unifoliates fully expanded. We're talking an inch and a half tall. And you go back to that image at 250-foot altitude at V1, you didn't see anything. So in this process, to do the binary thresholding and to get the canopy coverage, even at VC, low altitude, have high correlations. The next one that comes into play that I really want to hit is the GLI. That's going to be the green in that upper left. And then the other one I'll hit for today is vary. That's going to be the orange. The reason I'm hitting vary, some of these programs that are out there to do the stitching of your flights, they say plant health. They've typically gone to the vary to do that indice, but we've been finding some pretty good luck with the GLI, another vegetative indice with the red, green, blue. So those three are going to be our concentration. So dotted line canopy coverage, green is going to be the GLI, and then the orange is going to be the vary. Low altitude, we have canopy coverage covers it the whole way. As we go in a GLI on this one, by the time we get to about V3 is whenever that one pulls out and looks pretty good. Same for vary on this particular set. You'll notice that the vary at VC and V1 are very poor. Nice play on words with using vary, and that's poor. But that's low altitude. Go down to the high altitude though. So that's the whole field, 250-foot altitude planned flight, going across it, stitching it together, and then creating these same indices. So the whole field at VC, nothing really is tripping my trigger of being excited about, right? We have vary that's at the bottom. It's so much noise because there really isn't much going on. Even canopy coverage, 0.44 or so, not the greatest. GLI, 0.6, so not bad, really. Going to V1. By V1 on this whole field, we have canopy coverage, so dotted line about 0.85, correlation. GLI is pretty close, 0.8, very still down low at 0.3. So I'm not too impressed with it in terms of predicting the areas that need to have a plant stand looked at or replant, but very excited about this potential of a canopy coverage or GLI if we want to look at an index on a normal scale of scouting a field to say this has good correlation, let's run with it. And it maintains V1, V3. If you go beyond that for this idea of stand counts and assessments, we're going to get a little bit of noise because we get so much canopy coverage, but for this idea of vegetative stages, so V3 earlier, canopy coverage does a pretty good job. GLI is right there on these high altitudes. So pretty excited about that. Southeast farm, same seeding rates, but we had plant populations that were much lower, so a little tougher conditions to get out. And so I think that's why in the same setup, we have a little bit more noise in this low altitude, the V1. We're talking very low, less than 10,000 on some of these plant stands, so very low conditions to pick that up. So even canopy coverage isn't doing too well. The green being GLI and the vary being orange, not playing out. But by V4, it all comes up again. Get enough pixels out there. High altitude, I think it's struggling again because we have very low, not just 50,000, 10,000, 15,000. So super low stands that are hard to pick up. And at that point, you should definitely know that you've got issues. So it's this idea of trying to catch a 50 to 80,000 plant stand. Is that something that we need to address with this UAV system? So that's Southeast as a no-till condition. Davis in 2020, kind of going back to feeling pretty confident about what we've got. Canopy coverage in the upper, the low altitude, the upper graph, very high in terms of that correlation with plant population. 0.9 and holds it until it canopies and it drops a little bit because at that point everything's canopying, even the 80,000 plants. So that's why that correlation drops off because everything's canopied by R1 on that. GLI kind of poor early, but by V1 looking pretty good. Let's transition down to the high altitude. Again, that's the area I really want to be in because that's what you guys are going to do if we have this application. If I'm able to do a high altitude flight, have V1, get across that field in 20 minutes. I've got correlations that are 0.85 with a GLI. Canopy coverage is close. This is very promising to use this as a means to assess that field and stands and whether we have the ability to make a call. In the 2019 data, we were looking at canopy coverage and the idea of, okay, what optimal canopy coverage based on growth stage did we optimize yield? So in other words, we don't have to say it's 90,000 plants or 100,000. We'll do this post-mortem for a few years to kind of settle in on what's a proper canopy coverage. So in 2019, again, late planted year, by VC, if we had stands that had 4%, 4% canopy coverage, we optimized it. So think about that. You've got this image and you're counting 4% of green pixels. Again, you're not catching that. The computer's catching that. By the time we get to V1, I think it's closer to about 15%. So we're coming up with some pretty good numbers that are matching up with optimizing yield just based on canopy coverage or pixel counting of green versus the rest of the field. Not plants per se, but coverage. And what that does is how much are we harvesting sunlight to maximize that yield. So that's coming into play. I think that we have canopy coverage that's looking pretty promising. A few of these vegetative indices are coming into play. So we improve our spatial resolution as we go down to finer detail, no doubt. But this idea of, okay, how much is too much? We do need to have a little coarseness to do a little massaging, a little averaging across those. So to understand that background with plant population and the measurements that come into play. Just mentioned that little teaser at the end, that canopy coverage is very highly correlated with our plant populations, even as early as VC, V1. And so that does us very good in terms of this idea of catching an optimal plant population, or in other words, a canopy coverage to optimize our yield. Maybe 4% canopy coverage at VC, V1, if we got 10 to 15% canopy coverage, we're fine. And then the other one that's promising is at the high altitude, just doing the whole field, 250-foot altitude, and GLI, that vegetative indice, and even after V1, Vary's doing decent, but GLI seems to be hitting it earlier in growth stage and having a strong correlation with canopy coverage as well as plant population. So with that, we've got some more work ahead of us, but we appreciate the support from the WIN, the Wabash Heartland Innovation Network. They've provided a lot of funding for Richard in this, and in his work, I mean, it's his work that I'm presenting. I just get the joy of sharing it and the opportunity to say, we've got some fun things coming. So if you got any questions, I know you can't ask them here, but we've got our emails right there. So please give us a holler.
Thanks, Shaun. Sure enjoyed that. Richard, you're doing some good work here. So we got some time for some Q&A. For those of you that have joined us, feel free to hang around as long as we hang around here. I guess I'll just kick off with one, not seeing any in chat just yet. Shaun and Richard, you can both answer or arm wrestle to figure out who, virtually arm wrestle to see who wants to answer it. But if you could only have one index, which one would it be? Like, let's suppose indexes are really expensive and you can only buy one. Which one would you go with?
Well, I'll let Richard get his picture on and audio. As he's bringing up, I'll make my comment and he can correct me where I'm wrong. Where I'm at with this is to have the technology to run a red, green, blue camera, low cost, so then we can move forward. So then just regular digital camera, we don't have to worry about the multi-spec. I mean, and so far on the stand assessment, the GLI looks fabulous to me. And again, that's just where I'm at on the early season stand count. So that indice might be a different choice as we're thinking about disease management later or catching a stress later. But from what I can tell so far in his work, the one right now, the GLI, looks very promising. Richard,
remind me what those three letters mean. GLI.
Green leaf index.
Okay, green leaf. Okay, Richard.
I can't hear you, Richard.
Not catching your audio there. I'll mute you.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Good.
Okay, so I guess dealing with an RGB camera, probably what I've seen is that these vegetative indices either express green pixels, so they highlight green pixels, or they'll do the red pixels to express soil. So in terms of doing this research, I've found most success from the vegetative indices that express the plant pixels. So EXG, and which stands for excess greenness, as well as GLI, and also that green leaf index.
Okay. Excess greenness. That sounds like, what's that? I would love greenness. But there's a question posed in chat, which might be that excessive greenness. How do you think weeds will affect this work? That's a great question, Greg.
Yeah, that's my worry as well, right? So right now we're just talking green pixels. So if you got weeds out there, green pixels, I think that they're definitely complicating that. And so we have not teased that out. I think, we've had clean fields when these flights have been done. So I guarantee, until we have a way to separate those out, to have a mask or a screen, if you will, I think that's going to be very difficult.
Cool. Well, colleague John Scott posed the question, what software do you need to generate this green leaf index, and how expensive is that to someone who wants to do it?
Okay,
Well,
so
Rich,
I'll take
go
that
ahead.
one.
Yep.
So the programs any program would work. You're just doing raster algebra. So the ones that I use are free to anyone, open source. I usually use RStudio, but a more user-friendly way to do that would be with QGIS, Quantum GIS, which is also open source. And there's functions within QGIS that's called raster algebra that I'm pretty sure you could.
Okay. So I'm pretty sure we probably lost a couple in the audience there saying raster algebra, what in the world is that? So is it possible, maybe it's not available today, but maybe it's possible in the not too distant future, Purdue would just have a link, go download this package, import your image into QGIS or into RStudio. Here's how you download the package, and here's the link to the code to run so that you get your GLI. I mean, could we do that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible.
I mean, these are using the bands that come right with the digital image. And so, as far as a turnkey software that's out there, like a drone deployer, any of those other ones, I mean, they're using the same values to create a vary. Those same values are there. It's just a, 2G, it's just an extra layer of math at the same values, and to create the math, it's just a numerator denominator and set your work forward. So it's a matter of, okay, are there correlations that a company like Drone Deploy or others are going to put into their system and go ahead and run? Or like you said, if we have an open software or a package out of Purdue, I mean, that should be a straightforward thing.
Yeah, sounds good. So I think we've got, so Alex is writing, have you applied for CCA credits? Alan, are you asking with regard to this webinar series whether they apply? If so, I think we were actually pursuing that, but I don't remember how that got resolved. Yes, for the series. Stay tuned. If you registered, we will recommunicate in weeks to come, and we'll try to address that question for you.
Well, and then in terms of that video itself, I recorded that for our Indiana CCA conference, and so there's certainly credits within the crop management for that section.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, I don't want to extend it just for the case of extending it, but I have a couple more questions. Actually, I'm going to throw one. I hope this is fair. If it's not fair, just punt and say, if they can punt in the Super Bowl, well, you can punt in a webinar for sure. So let me just pose this one. You talked about the total wetness index and how things are related to it, etc. Let's suppose I wanted to confirm that the computed total wetness index actually was pretty good. How long, is there an ideal time to fly a drone to get an image that I could then use to confirm, well, that model for total wetness index actually does match what's happening in my field? How would you do that?
Well, I'll let Richard answer, but I'll go ahead and quickly say that I misspoke. It's topographic wetness index. I kept saying total. Oh, sorry. What? No, but I mean, that's what I was doing in the talk there, but it is topographic. So okay. Just make sure that's true. Richard, love your feedback on Dennis's question.
Okay, so if there's a lot of variability in elevation within a field, generally you're going to see areas of the field which hold moisture longer. And that's usually the lower areas of the field, and the top of the hills or the sides of the hills generally are drier. And drier soils are most of the time a lighter color. So you could I know that they do some work with soil remote sensing, looking at soil moisture, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how effective our imagery would work. I know that they use stuff like different sorts of remote sensing.
Okay.
But yeah, the perfect time to do it would be probably after a good rain. As it starts to dry up, you'd start seeing variation within the field.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on the soil type, whether you wait 2 days after a rain or 4 or 5 days after a rain, but somewhere in there, probably you'd start to see the differences.
Well, then you also have to come into play, is that a no-till field versus a conventional till, to catch that reflection of,
Yeah.
a darker soil or a lighter soil that's drying out. So yeah, certainly that comes in play with a red, green, blue digital camera itself. I mean, running a multi-spec might be another option though.
Yeah. Well, let's take John Scott's other question sort of as the last one for today. So he's asking, what software are you using to capture the data? Is it Drone Deploy or maybe some open source? So when you capture the data, what software are you using?
I'll take that. So the software, the flight planning app that we use for all of the flights is Drone Deploy, which is not free, I think.
Yep. So that's the flight pattern as well as capturing and stitching the flights. So, and then you go from there to run it through your various GIS programs.
Right. Yeah, we just use that to plan the flights, and then I export it from that after it's orthomosaic.
Very good. Well, again, thanks to all of you for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Shaun Casteel, and soon to be Dr. Richard Smith. We appreciate you sharing the insights. And so you'll see there, we revisited the slides about the upcoming webinars. We invite you to certainly participate when the interest and your time allows. And of course, catch them on the rebound in the recorded version later as needed. Thanks again. I wish you all the very best. Try to stay warm. The chill is definitely in the air this season. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.